Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this very special webinar all about coping with emotional eating and eating disorders in Ramadan. This is such a critical topic that we do not discuss enough in the Muslim community. So I'm so excited to bring a very special guest to share some practical tips with us on how we can make sure we're developing a healthier relationship with our bodies, with food, especially in this blessed month of Ramadan. So before we jump in, I just want to remind everyone that at Amal Fitness, our goal is to help us improve our health, especially in Ramadan in all areas. So this is that time, middle of Ramadan, where many of us start experiencing that Ramadan slump, start losing steam, start losing energy. And the way that you treat your body, your food and fitness makes such a big impact. So if you're struggling with tiredness, low energy, feeling hungry, let us give you a boost in Ramadan. Check out our popular Ramadan Reset Guidebook for a complete dietitian's meal plan and over 70 delicious, healthy ethnic recipes to power your best Ramadan. So inside the guidebook, you will find recipes from all around the world, perfectly planned out for you in a meal plan that will energize you and help you get through this month strong. You can check that out at ramadanreset.com. And the best part is that 100% of all profits are donated to charity. Alhamdulillah, over the past 2 years, we've been able to donate over $41,500 from the Ramadan Reset Project. So check it out. Do something great for your family, yourself, your health, and spread some love to families in need. As well, remember that we have free Ramadan workouts that we have been sharing all month long. So join myself and my husband for our Ramadan workout videos. You can get them all at ramadanreset.com/workouts. Every single day, just 5, 10, or 12 minutes long, you'll get an amazing, energizing, full body workout. If you haven't been doing our workouts yet, that's totally fine. You can still jump in and join us. There are no equipment for all fitness levels, so bring the family, energize your body together. I guarantee the way you will feel after that workout and how that transforms your fast is worth the effort. So check out our Ramadan Reset workouts and download your free workout calendar at the link. All right, so let's jump into today's discussion, eating disorders and emotional eating in Ramadan. Let's bring in our special guest. I've invited a very special registered social worker who specializes in family therapy. Amal Qutub is going to be sharing practical solutions and awareness on this critical health issue, especially in Ramadan. So Amal has particular expertise working with children, adolescents, and families, supporting their biopsychosocial and spiritual well-being. Her therapeutic modalities include cognitive behavioral therapy, solution-focused brief therapy, narrative therapy, and emotion-focused family therapy. She's a fantastic resource who is really going to help us walk through the journey of identifying some of the problematic behaviors we might have that could lead to disordered eating, practical solutions for us to really heal from this, inshallah, in this blessed month. Please welcome Amal Qutub.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everyone. It's really nice to join you here today and talk about eating disorders and Ramadan. So just before we get started, I want to provide you with a disclaimer that this talk today is more for educational purposes. This doesn't constitute therapy. When it comes to mental health, it's very complex and there isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. But we're really hoping that through this presentation, it can raise your awareness, whether these are challenges you're facing yourself or a family member or a friend. Awareness is the first step to getting the support that you need. And having said that, I'm also aware that this topic can be very triggering for many people. And this is just a word of caution, just to proceed with caution, be kind to yourself, give yourself what you need as you go through this talk, pace yourself. And then towards the end of this presentation, I made sure to provide you with some resources that you can reach out to as well. So an overview for what we'll cover today, inshallah, we'll have 3 main headings. We'll start off by going over the continuum of eating disorders. Then we'll go over the risks and protective factors. And then we'll wrap it up with the context of eating disorders in the month of Ramadan. So before that, why did we choose this topic? And really, it's for 2 main reasons: for awareness, raising our awareness, and also to develop more empathy for those who are going through eating disorder related challenges during this month and out of this month as well. As you can see here, during the pandemic, it was such a big trigger for many youth and many adults to actually develop eating disorders. These are just screenshots of some CBC news related articles, global news related articles, local news here in the Greater Toronto area that cover just the prevalence of eating disorders and the increase of eating disorders over the pandemic. One of the main contributors to that, it's not the only reason why eating disorders happen, but a big contributor to that is the increased use of social media. So during the pandemic, a lot of people were staying more home. A lot of people turned to social media to cope, to make the time pass. And many of us may mindlessly be consuming social media without realizing what, the kind of content we are exposing ourselves to. In fact, Dr. Jennifer Mills, she's a psychologist at York University that studies this kind of thing. And she says that social media is a contributor to body dissatisfaction, especially for young women. And the statistics are alarming. So the National Eating Disorder Information Center estimates that up to 40% of 9-year-old girls have dieted at one point for the purpose of losing weight, even when they're actually at a normal weight. So what this tells us is that from a very young age, we're bombarded by all these messages that we need to diet or attain a certain kind of image or a certain kind of weight. And for this reason, a lot of people may go into extreme measures just so they can attain what might feel like, it's never enough, or they may attain, for an image that they may look up to, or that they may want to attain that's just not realistic. And unfortunately, these are a lot of the factors that can lead into developing an eating disorder. So one of the things about awareness is that it leads to early prevention and early diagnosis, which is known to play a very big role in the recovery and treatment. So when we are more familiar with this topic, we can develop more awareness and more empathy, and we can feel empowered to take the first step. So when we talk about eating disorders, we'd like to describe it as a continuum. We tend to think about eating behaviors as on two extremes. So there's like healthy eating or like unhealthy eating, on two opposite extremes. In fact, when we look at wellness and healthy eating habits, it can encompass everything, including eating a variety of foods, eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full, knowing that there isn't such a thing as good food or bad food, just having a general healthy relationship with approaching food and nutrition. Learning how to regulate your own hunger when it comes to knowing when you feel satisfied or meeting your body's needs. Eating without the associated feelings of guilt or shame or anxiety or all these like overwhelming feelings that, many individuals may be experiencing. And being able to enjoy, comfort food from time to time without the occasional, again, strong feelings of shame and anxiety that might come up with it as well. So again, when we're looking at the continuum, it's important to remember that these disorders or these challenges, they're much more than just about food. They actually involve the way we feel about ourselves. They involve how we cope with feelings and other factors related to how we derive our self-worth. So with the first stage, when it comes to preoccupation with food and body, these are experiences where many of us may actually experience at one point in our life. These are challenges when we may feel like we are dissatisfied with our appearance or consistently trying to lose a few pounds here and there. We may start being occupied by some frequent thoughts of food or trying to lose weight or eating or our body image. Sometimes we may experience feelings of guilt or feeling bad for what we may have eaten, so we may try to make it up in other ways. And we may fall, again, like I mentioned, in this category at different stages in our life. So developmentally, it's normal for preteens and teenagers to become more aware of their bodies and how they're changing and to become more occupied with that experience. Perhaps even those who are transitioning into motherhood and the postpartum period, it's natural that we may fall into the stage, but the whole point of thinking of it as a continuum is just to see and assess where you fall on that continuum as you move forward. Now, the concern develops when we head into the disordered eating symptoms, because at this point, not only are we thinking about it or noticing it, we're actually taking up behaviors. So when individuals start eating for reasons other than hunger, so to fulfill an emotion or to fill a void because of an emotion, when extreme feelings of boredom or stress or anger may be the reason or the trigger for our food and eating habits, that's where the concerns start to rise. So emotional eating is basically one of those experiences that falls into the disordered eating patterns. And again, it's related to using food in response to intense emotions as a way of just coping with these emotions. And one thing we know about emotions, there isn't a way around them or, under them or over them. Emotions have to be experienced all the way through. So when we use food as a way of just going around the emotions, we're not really resolving the underlying issues here. And, we've all done it. We've all been in this stage at one point. So for me personally, whether it was trying to get an unhealthy snack, unfortunately, while I'm trying to write like a paper for university, or maybe I've had a long, hard day at work and I just need to cool off at the end of the day and I go in the drive-thru and grab an ice cap. This is very normal. We've all done it. Like there's a reason why food makes us feel good. It can be self-soothing. It's connected to the reward center, the dopamine center in the brain. There's a self-soothing effect of certain foods that we eat. The problem becomes when this becomes our only way of coping. That if every time you're stressed out, you go through the drive-thru, or if every time you're stressed out, you cope by eating a certain kind of food. So that's where the slippery slope is, when this becomes our only way of coping, and the only way we can make sense of these emotions is through numbing them out through eating. Or the opposite extreme. So for some, they may numb it out through eating, and some may numb it out by not eating anything at all. So starting to skip meals, engaging in maybe purging behavior. Again, because of just the amount of stress that they may be going through, eating presents an opportunity for them to exercise some control. So they might go the other extreme and actually start restricting the kind of foods that they bring into their body. What's really important to note here is that this is not an eating disorder per se, but behaviors that can potentially become dangerous and lead into the eating disorders. At the same time, not every disordered eating leads into an eating disorder. So it's important to make that distinction. But I have a quote here by Dr. Russell Mayhew, who's a professor at the University of Calgary. And she mentioned that diagnosable eating disorders are rare, but the behaviors that lead to them are not. So for many of us, it may be for ourselves, our loved ones, our family, we may know quite a lot of people who fall into this category that engage in disordered eating. They may not have the label or the diagnosis per se, but they're demonstrating the symptoms or the behaviors that eventually lead into an eating disorder. So now, eating disorders. So when does disordered eating turn into an eating disorder? What we look at are the frequency, the severity, and the impact that it has on your functioning. So when it starts to negatively impact your life, when everything in your life starts to resolve around your eating patterns, your food patterns, your weight, when there's an experienced loss of control, that's when you may be headed into the eating disorder territory pretty much. What's really important to note is that eating disorders are considered to be a mental illness. So it's not a phase, it's not an experience, it's a full mental illness that requires a medical professional to diagnose. So there are strict diagnostic criteria based on the diagnostic manual, the DSM, that are used to diagnose an eating disorder. So they're very complex. It's not about just eating or just put anything in your mouth. So telling someone with an eating disorder to just eat, it's like telling somebody with depression to just cheer up and just smile. So it's really important to recognize them for the complexity and the seriousness for what they are. Because it's more than just about food, or actually like bringing food into your body or restricting food from your body. They're more so about how you feel about yourself, how you're coping with your feelings, and the other deeper factors that we also addressed as well. So there's serious psychiatric illnesses. In fact, eating disorders represent the second highest mortality rate of all mental illnesses after opioid overdose. So it just shows you how serious and how much it can really not just impact the individual, but the family unit altogether. So we always say when there's someone in the family that has an eating disorder, the whole family is going through that journey. It's not just that one person. So over here, I'm just sharing with you, there are a lot of different eating disorder diagnoses. I'm just sharing with you the three most common ones, or the three most commonly known ones. And the first one is anorexia nervosa. And that's where you have an eating disorder in which food intake is severely limited. So you limit how much you eat so that the person actually does not meet the minimum requirement for their weight and for their height, for their age group. And the other element, the psychological element of that, is that with anorexia, there is a big fear of just gaining any kind of weight, to the point that some individuals may experience the fear of drinking water, fearing that that might add onto their weight as well. And again, the whole underlying psychological element of the perception of how they're viewing their body, how they're viewing their self-worth in connection with their physical body. It's their perception of their physical body is quite distorted. So when it comes to bulimia nervosa, so it's an eating disorder characterized by frequent binge eating episodes or the use of laxatives. So whenever an individual engages in binge eating, they engage in something to compensate for or like to make up for the binge eating episode. So that's when they might resort to vomiting, or they might resort to the use of laxatives or over-exercising as a way of just kind of like making up for all that food that they ate. And again, the psychological element to that is that there's that preoccupation with body, with weight, with shape, and that distorted image as well. And finally, binge eating disorder, that's when a person eats enormous amounts of food in a short period of time, but there isn't anything that they do to compensate for it. So that's what distinguishes it from bulimia. And binges are usually associated with strong feelings of shame, disgust, anxiety, a lack of control, in part to just how frequent and intense they feel for that person. And most importantly, they must be diagnosed by a medical professional. It's so easy now to Google our symptoms and say, yes, I'm anorexic, or yes, I'm bulimic, which, by the way, is another challenge that, we want to move away from using that as an identity and just and if a person was to face a challenge with anorexia, we refer to that person as someone facing a challenge with anorexia. We don't use it as a way of describing them, because their whole identity is not just anorexia, or their whole identity is not just bulimia. And again, it moves away from the stigma that sometimes our language may put on people accessing eating disorders. So it must be diagnosed by a medical professional. This graph over here, again, it's a graph that was in an article published by Dr. Russell Mayhew, the professor at University of Calgary. And what's really nice about this graph is that you can see an association between the attitudes of health and the behaviors of health. So it demonstrates the relationship between the way, our attitude towards our body image, how we perceive ourselves, and the behaviors that we end up engaging in regarding our eating patterns. So on the horizontal axis, it signifies like the different feelings, attitudes that we have about our bodies, again, in a continuum that ranges from like healthy kind of attitudes to unhealthy kind of attitudes. Then when we have when we look at the vertical axis, we can notice that, there's a range of behaviors as well, between those that are health promoting at the bottom, all the way up to those that are health deterring. So those that pose a barrier to actually engage in healthy behaviors. So when it comes to the three blue ovals that are in the middle of the graph, you start off at the body awareness and acceptance. And that's the area where, it's characterized by healthy attitudes, healthy behaviors. There's an overall acceptance for our bodies and an understanding that the way we look is only one part of who we are. It's not the only thing that determines our value. Then moving forward to body preoccupation, that's when we develop an over-concern with our bodies, particularly around weight and shape and image and the way we perceive ourselves. And then finally, moving to the last oval, the third oval, the body paralysis. That's the one that's associated with the unhealthiest kind of attitudes. The body paralysis is the experience of being so immobilized by the way we feel about our body. And again, that loss of control of all the behaviors, attitudes, and symptoms that we've experienced. And it develops when controlling the body becomes the primary focus of our life. So again, everything in our life starts revolving around that eating disorder. The eating disorder becomes the one in charge, not us. We're not the ones in charge. So moving on to risk factors. So The challenge is that a lot of times we want the one answer, like what is the one cause? And the thing is, when it comes to mental health, there's never one cause. It's always multifactorial. So we're always looking at the biopsychosocial kind of factors that contribute to it. So what does it mean by saying biopsychosocial? There are biological factors. So biological factors that contribute. So it doesn't mean that if you have it, you will develop an eating disorder. It just means that it increases your risk or you're more predisposed. So a simple biological factor to develop an eating disorder is having a close relative who has been diagnosed by an eating disorder. So studies of families, have found that having a first-degree relative, so someone like a parent or a sibling with an eating disorder, increases a person's risk of developing an eating disorder. Having another close family member with another mental health condition, so it may not be may not be an eating disorder per se, but it could be perhaps an untreated depression, anxiety, or any other mental illness. And the reason for that is because, when someone in the family is experiencing a mental health illness that's not being treated, there will be an impact on others in the family. So what the eating disorder sometimes serves some individuals is that it gives them some kind of control in their life. And sometimes when it feels like there's so much chaos around you, the only tangible thing within your day that you can probably control is what you eat or what you don't eat. So it can start off from there. It can start off from a place of me trying to cope with just how difficult it is around me. But then if you're already predisposed biologically, that's where the slippery slope is of actually developing a full, like a full eating disorder diagnosis. History of dieting. So whether individually or as a family, if there's that culture of dieting, the whole word of diet, we need to go into weight control programs or weight control measurements or management programs, that whole kind of culture is a risk factor to developing disordered eating and then later on an eating disorder. A negative energy balance. So what that means is some people just end up burning off more calories than they take in for a variety of reasons. So we see that with athletes. And actually, athletes are at a high risk of developing an eating disorder. A lot of times we think it's, just certain segments of society and perhaps athletes are the healthiest, but actually no, there's like a whole literature about supporting athletes who develop an eating disorder because there's so much focus on their physical performance, especially even around males, for example, in sports like wrestling and other kind of sports that require you to be at a certain weight or eat certain things or develop certain kind of muscles. They're also at a risk of developing an eating disorder. It's just not commonly discussed. Other risk factors under the whole negative energy balance is when you may have a chronic illness. So you may lose weight faster than your ability to actually gain that weight back. One interesting fact I found here was that those with type 1 diabetes, recent research has found that approximately 1/4 of women diagnosed with type 1 diabetes will develop an eating disorder. And the most common pattern was skipping their insulin injections, which can be quite deadly. So these are all biological risk factors that can increase a person's chance of developing an eating disorder. Now, moving on to the psychological factors. So, believe it or not, perfectionism. One of the strongest factors to develop an eating disorder is to have perfectionist kind of tendencies. Especially when that perfectionism is turned towards you, like you're setting such a high bar for yourself, such high expectations for yourself. There's a big association between the tendency to be perfectionist and the possibility of developing an eating disorder. There is that whole relationship between, not being satisfied with just enough. So putting such a big load, such a big expectation on yourself. Other psychological factors, your own personal history of probably anxiety or depression that's not been treated. So again, research has shown that a lot of people that get diagnosed with eating disorders, once they dig into their history and find out that 2/3 of those, for example, diagnosed with anorexia, they showed early signs of an eating disorder much earlier than they were diagnosed with that eating disorder. Another factor is just having that behavioral inflexibility. So again, many people with anorexia, for example, they report that when they were kids, as children, they always followed the rules. to a T. They felt there was only one way of doing things. They were very rigid in doing, whatever is expected of them. There isn't flexibility. So that kind of temperament or that kind of tendency can be a risk factor and can increase, somebody's risk in developing an eating disorder. And finally, when it comes to social and cultural factors, so, weight stigma is real. The message to be thin is everywhere around us. Like I mentioned earlier today, like around 40% of girls at the age of 9 have experimented with some kind of dieting. So if you think, like, for a 9-year-old, what kind of messages have they been exposed to at that age that it led them to even take action and start experimenting with dieting? It shows you that the culture around us is all about, like, thinner is better, thinner is what's needed, thinner is the goal. As human beings, whatever we expose ourselves to, as much as we think that, that doesn't get to us, there's a lot of psychology in there that whatever you expose yourself to, it eventually becomes your inner dialogue, it starts forming your thoughts, and it starts affecting how you view yourself. So it's really important to be aware of the messages and the environment that you place yourself in. Teasing, bullying, these have all been reported as risk factors as well, especially if it was related to weight, body image, body size. And again, buying into the message that there's that ideal body, that ideal image. And for many of us, there was even like a recent lawsuit or something that I read about social media platforms like Instagram that make everything look so filtered and so good that there's always an ideal thing. So like the ideal meal or the ideal body or the ideal workout. So again, it's tied into the perfectionism that there's never that enough. There's always that I'm just not enough. I need to always strive for the next thing. So let's balance it out with some protective factors. Because a lot of times we could get caught up in just talking about the risk factors and feel like, oh, now what? I've got that family history. I may have, like some of those tendencies or maybe disordered thinking tendencies. And this is where I want you to balance it out with the protective factors. And, you can think of it as individual, family, social, cultural, sociocultural factors. And Islam and spirituality kind of like spans through all of them. And we'll see how. So starting with the individual level, some of the protective factors are developing healthy coping strategies with stress, problem-solving skills. And these are all skills that we develop from a young age. So you don't wait until you're 15 or 20 to develop healthy coping skills with stress. You start from a very young age. So if you're a parent, if you're a caregiver, if you're an adult, a coach, and you deal with little kids, start from a very young age around basically how to cope with stress, because stress is something that everyone experiences. So the earlier that you develop your ability to cope with stress, the stronger and the more equipped you will be as you grow older and actually face real life challenges that will require you to use these healthy coping strategies. Problem solving skills as well. Again, this is like one of the antidotes to the perfectionism, where in perfectionism we might get stuck in like there's only a one way of doing something. Developing problem solving skills that get you to reframe and to view a situation differently is one of the most important protective factors we can develop. And again, it doesn't just start with adults, it starts from a young age. You want to make it a lifestyle, a way of just approaching life altogether. So eating disorders are also about managing really strong feelings of distress, feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety. So developing emotional awareness of yourself, being able to identify your feelings, being able to cope with these strong feelings. And again, like we say about feelings, there's no way around them, there's no way under them or over them. The only way is to go through them. So, one of the things we mention in therapy is that you have to feel it to heal it. And, that goes against like all the messages that we get in our society that we have a lot of things that numb the pain for ourselves. You've got a headache, you can pop a Tylenol or an Advil. You've got a stomach ache, you can do this thing to get rid of it. So the whole like developing your distress tolerance, your ability to tolerate that emotional distress is not something that we're good at, not just as individuals, but also as a society. So developing that healthy approach to emotions as well is really important. So other, individual factors, that can, serve as protective factors for ourselves and serve, strengthen our resilience is avoiding trendy diets. So trendy diets, crash diets, these are all little simple kind of it might seem a very innocent way of trying to approach like a wholesome kind of living. However, these are all slippery slopes that we can fall into. So instead, try to adopt more of like a wholesome kind of moderation approach to just everything in life, really, to eating, exercising, all of these important factors, and just approach things in moderation. Setting healthy limits on exercise as well, learning what kind of exercise works for your body, and physical exercise, is important, but it's also important to be mindful of just like the frequency and the reason for the reason why you're exercising. So the whole intention, your niyyah behind it all makes a big difference, because that also plays on the other psychological trigger that the eating disorders have on how we interpret why we do certain things. Other things, speaking about our thoughts, the way we speak to ourselves, right? So stopping the negative talk, stopping the self-deprecating statements that we say to ourselves. Instead of negatively critiquing our body, shifting whenever we look at the mirror, whenever we get dressed, shifting that to notice what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us in our body, noticing what our body, alhamdulillah, can do for us. Seeing our body in a different light, that it's a vehicle to help us move forward and, fulfill our responsibilities. Taking time to appreciate all the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted us in our body. They say that the first wealth is health. And subhanAllah, there's that hadith that talks about how take advantage of 5 before 5, and health being one of them, because we do take it for granted. So shifting our focus from the ideal body, the ideal image, to alhamdulillah, I am breathing. Alhamdulillah, I am able to move forward. I am not fatigued. Alhamdulillah, I'm able to fulfill my responsibilities and use my body to get me closer to Allah and accomplish my goals and whatnot. So again, that whole reframe of the way we talk to ourselves is really important as well. And another tangible thing we can do is to actually throw away the scale. That's just numbers. The scale can become such an obsession for many of us that it can lead us to extreme patterns of being obsessed over that number that shows up on the scale. Someone once told me a joke that, imagine if there's some kind of a flaw in the scale and it was just doing tricks on you and giving you the wrong number. So imagine that you're giving so much power to that number that's showing up on the scale to play around with pretty much your survival, because for eating disorders, like we know, it's the second highest mortality rate. So how much power do you want to give to those numbers that you see on the scale? What if it was flawed in the first place? What if the batteries were dying and it was showing up, showing the wrong number on the scale? So moving on to family. So family can play such a big, important protective factors when it comes to, the feelings of belonging, acceptance, love within a family, emotional safety, also lack of judgment or steering away from judgment. And especially when it comes to judgment around our eating patterns, judgment around our body size as well. And I really have to point it out here that, unfortunately, in many communities, and it happens in our community, there is such a big emphasis on the girl per se to look a certain way for the purposes of marriage or for the goal of getting married. Whereas if we just shift that to, just to be healthy for the purpose of you fulfilling your purpose as a Muslim woman, or for you fulfilling your purpose of taking your health as an amana, as a trust from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just shifting the way we talk about things can really make a big difference in our families as well. Promoting healthy relationship with food, so moving away from the whole good food, bad food, terrible food. Alhamdulillah, food is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's all it's all a tool at the end of the day. It's all about how you want to use that tool. Another important role that families can play is modeling. So a lot of times, when we hear of that statistic that 40% of 9-year-olds have tried dieting, it might make us cringe and wonder oh my gosh, that's horrible. But then do you ever listen into a group of adult women together, talking together, or a group of aunties gathering together, how many comments we actually do make about body size, whether it's our body size or someone else's body size. There's a lot of comment around the physical appearance of others. So kids hear us, and kids can see what is it that we model. And sometimes modeling is not about what you say, it's about what you do. So how much of these attitudes do you also practice in your circle of friends? Because the kids around you, that future generation, they're going to pick up on these messages early on. Sociocultural factors, so being involved in sports that promote like sportsmanship and great values, and that move the emphasis away from the whole physical attractiveness per se or the thinness. So these are ways that we can engage in protective factors on like a sociocultural level. And finally, media literacy and body acceptance. So when a person is able to accept who they are for what they are, appreciate and respect their body, that improves their self-esteem, self-acceptance, their healthy outlook and behaviors. And subhanAllah, like you can see how Islam and spirituality, they fit through all of these levels, all the way from the individual, all the way up to the societal level. On the individual level, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has placed our value for innate in us, not just based on our body size and how we look, but it's based on our taqwa. This is the only category that we got to use to compete with one another and use it as our the bar that we want to aim high for. Same on a family level. Like there was never a reason that one of the reasons for seeking marriage is about attaining that body, the perfect body image or whatnot. There's so many other spiritual reasons that were rooted in the experience of marriage. Yet culturally, unfortunately, we moved away from that, and we focus more on you got to look a certain way in order to attain this goal or in order to obtain this marriage goal or whatnot. So you can just see that spirituality in Islam plays on all levels. So Ramadan and eating disorders. The emphasis on food and the drastic changes that happen in our routine, in our diet, in our sleep can be quite a big trigger for many people with mental health illnesses, and more so for people with eating disorders or disordered eating. Ramadan can also make it easier to disguise an eating disorder. After all, everyone's fasting, everyone's not eating or drinking all day. So it can make it easier to hide those symptoms if you've already been struggling with them before Ramadan. And also it's another trigger for people who struggle with binge eating disorder, because you may be more tempted to overindulge at meal times. And there's also that communal aspect where many of us may be sharing our iftars with other people, maybe attending iftar parties, and that can also be a trigger for those who struggle in eating in public or with eating in public, or even coping with comments that may be made about the way their body looks or about their eating habits or whatnot. And for example, there are some people with an eating disorder that have been advised medically to not fast. But because it's not like a physical illness, sometimes it's not just it's not a physical illness. Sometimes it's not just seen directly. For some people, they might feel that they may face criticism from others, like maybe you're not sick enough, or maybe your doctor is exaggerating your symptoms or whatnot. Of course, the decision whether to fast or not, that's a decision to make with your medical team. To take into consideration your vitals, your health status, all of these important considerations. But some people who may not be able to fast actually may face some criticism or some unnecessary questioning sometimes that can increase these feelings of shame. And some of us may also have underlying disordered eating thoughts, and without realizing that we've been experiencing them. And the whole experience in Ramadan may reiterate them. So for example, as you can see here on the screen, like perhaps thoughts that now you have permission to binge eat because you were good all day by fasting. Again, shifting away from the intention of fasting to equating that there's a reward, that food is a reward, where food is a necessity. It is something that's required for our survival. Or perhaps the idea that fasting earns you food at iftar, again, the whole like reward and earning food, versus actually fasting to obtain consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or restricting food past sunset versus following the sunnah of breaking your fast as soon as Maghrib prayer starts, or as soon as sunset happens. There isn't any extra reward that you get if you delay your iftar by like 15-20 minutes. But what wins in that case is your disordered eating, the disordered eating thoughts, or your eating disorder thoughts. That's the one that's winning then. The physical discomfort that we might get sometimes, maybe some people may experience it in, say, the first couple of days of Ramadan. For some of us, it may trigger feelings of guilt. So getting so caught up in that guilt and getting caught up in that uncomfortable emotion versus exploring new approaches of breaking your fast, perhaps experimenting with new kind of foods. Perhaps you've developed a food sensitivity, maybe starting out by dates, having some dates, then some water, pacing yourself. So that physical discomfort, it can lead into getting caught up in the feelings of guilt, or we can reframe it and start exploring problem-solving skills, start exploring other ways of addressing that physical discomfort. So finally, like the question to even ask ourselves that sometimes we may fall in this trap throughout the year as well. Is our intention to fast to honor religious practices? Is it to honor Allah, our obligation towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or is it to honor the eating disorder or the disordered eating? And finally, as we head into the practical tips in Ramadan, so I heavily relied on this amazing toolkit by the Family and Youth Institute that I recommend all of you to check out. So the organization is the Family and Youth Institute Ramadan Toolkit, and the name of it is 6 Tips for Coping with an Eating Disorder in Ramadan. So they outline 6 tips, they go more into detail about them. So I'll just go over them very quickly for today. So especially if you're actively in treatment for an eating disorder, or you're in a different part of your recovery, again, your medical team may actually advise you against fasting. And this might trigger, a lot of feelings of shame or embarrassment that perhaps what you may have is not a real illness. I want to remind you that eating disorders is a real illness. It's a real mental illness, and it is very serious. It's the second highest mortality rate. It is, and it never resolves on its own. It needs the involvement of a medical team around you. So if you were ever accommodated by your medical team and given that option to perhaps observe the fast in a different way or to delay engaging in the fast, take that accommodation. After all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for every religious ruling that He has brought down, there's always an alternative or an exception, which can also be seen as a form of rahmah. It's not that you're less than of a Muslim. It's a form of rahmah. It's a form of mercy that He has provided for us as well. And this is why it's important to also focus on what is it that we can do in Ramadan, not what we can't do. So if fasting is something that you actually can't do, let's focus on what is it that we can do to observe the month of Ramadan. Other equal ways of observing Ramadan that is not just the fasting. So if we only focus on food during Ramadan, we miss the whole point of this month altogether. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran didn't say food, stay away from food, and that's it. All the verses that talk about fasting also talk about the importance of engaging in Quran, engaging in remembrance, engaging in Duaa. So there are so many other neglected kind of worship that because we focus so much on the fast per se, we end up neglecting. So Ramadan is more about that spiritual growth, that self-development. What goals are you setting for yourself to engage in things other than fasting, if fasting is something that you're unable to do? Whether it's going to extra Taraweeh prayers or engaging in extra Sunnah prayers or reading more Quran or memorizing the Quran, volunteering or feeding others or being more charitable. So decentralize food and prioritize the focus of your Ramadan on self-development altogether. So the second tip is about using social media mindfully. And I recently listened to a nice reminder that talked about, as we fast, a lot of times we focus again about the physical fast, but sometimes we also need that psychological fast, that, psychological fast on social media. Perhaps certain pages that we need to unfollow or new pages that we need to follow. Just being mindful of the kind of content that we expose ourselves to. One of the earlier screenshots that I had about the news article that was published very recently talks about the algorithms on social media have worked so much in favor of all the pro-eating disorder pages as well, because of just how much they're being consumed. And sometimes we're not even aware of it. So just being mindful of how to use social media. Social media is a tool. You can use it to benefit yourself or you can use it to harm yourself. So just being mindful of what role is it playing in your life at this point. The third tip is about gathering intentionally with others. So a lot of times when we gather in Ramadan, we gather around meals, we gather around iftars, which is great, alhamdulillah, but also look into other ways of connecting with others. So whether it's, gathering to volunteer for a cause together, or to visit the elderly, or any other cause that we'd like to work on together, joining a halaqah group, or organizing a weekly halaqah group together, or a learning circle, maybe starting a support group with others in your community that you may have become aware that they're also having their own challenges with disordered eating or eating disorder. So just looking at other ways of getting that social connection aside from just gathering around food. And number 4 talks about the importance of just reaching out to someone, talking to someone about your symptoms. What we know about shame is that shame thrives in secrecy, and subhanAllah, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests people in different ways, and mental illness is one way that people get tested through, and so are eating disorders. They're not a choice. No one chooses to develop an eating disorder. Perhaps early on in the continuum, we might think that we're choosing this. Eating disorders are not a lifestyle. It's a mental illness. So, and for those who are diagnosed by it, this is a challenge. This is a trial by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, reaching out to someone, to confide in someone, a safe person, someone who could be part of our safety plan, that, hey, you know what, I'm going to go to this iftar party. I think it might be triggered when that person asks me questions about my eating, or maybe when the food is laid out on the table, or whatever your triggers may be. I just need you to be a support person with me at that event or whatnot. Getting that solidarity, that support around you, it makes a big difference. One of the thoughts, when you talk to individuals going through an eating disorder, that you ask them, like, tell me about your journey before you took that first step of seeking professional help. They always say, or many of them say, the thought of, am I sick enough, is a thought that keeps coming, it kept preventing me from actually taking the first step. That how much more can I push with my symptoms and function enough just so I don't have to take that first step. So if you're ever getting the thought, am I sick enough? Am I sick enough? That means you are sick enough to actually take that first step. Because early prevention is key. You don't want to reach the point where it's a full-out eating disorder that's been going on for years. And research shows that it takes around 7 years, since the onset of the symptoms until the person actually takes that first step for professional help. So imagine if the whole 7 years a person was asking themselves, am I sick enough to take the step? How much more complex it might make the recovery for them. So seeking professional help, eating disorders don't go away on their own. They are not a phase. Even if they, might show up in teenage years and then kind of like cool down a bit, if they're not addressed from the roots, because there's that psychological factors, there's that disordered thought element to it, they won't just phase out on their own. And recovery is possible. This is like totally connected to the 6th point of harnessing the power of Duaa. Duaa is your first step of recovery. Duaa, makes you like recognize that there's a problem, makes you recognize that no matter what problem you're facing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His power overpowers any kind of problem that's facing us, and that there isn't a challenge, or there isn't a trial, there isn't an illness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought down on this earth, including eating disorder, except that there is treatment for it, except that there's healing and recovery for it. So, in this month of Ramadan, harnessing the power of Duaa is one of the first steps that we can do towards recovery. And finally, you've got the verse here from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 186. وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ. This is like the superpower that all of us have to that we can use to harness in this blessed month of Ramadan.
SubhanAllah, beautiful, beautiful points. And I actually just want to just kind of address some of those in a bit of a Q&A. As you were sharing, you mentioned a lot about this aspect of considering the spectrum, right? And so I think that this is something really important for us to take away. So of course, so many people are thinking in Ramadan, we want to get healthy, we want to be, thinking about healthier habits. And it's about recognizing that how does a normal kind of wanting to become healthier, how can little steps kind of take that into that realm of disordered eating, such as a big preoccupation on the scale? I always love to emphasize, drop the obsession with the scale, that we have to really focus on how our body feels and everything. So I really wanted to highlight that. Now, of course, you mentioned that dieting specifically is a risk factor. And so now we're going to have, like, I think definitely a bit of confusion that comes up of somebody who wants to lose weight. Perhaps their doctor has also told them you need to lose weight for your health. At the same time, we don't want to jump into that area where we're having some disordered eating behaviors. Mm-hmm. So any advice on bridging that gap there in terms of wanting to be healthier while recognizing that the process of dieting can very quickly spiral into disordered eating?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not a dietitian, so I have to know what my limits are.
Yeah.
But it's all about, but one hadith that, I live by is, small, consistent actions are better than big and interrupted actions. And I think that this hadith, we can almost apply it to also the way that we approach health and the way that we approach exercise and healthy eating and well-being all together. So it's all about like developing sustainable, consistent kind of habits. And generally speaking, diets move you away from that. So you want to look into more of like the lifestyle approach rather than I'm following X diet or X approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I also think that kind of just, as you mentioned, having the awareness of some of these behaviors that fall on that spectrum, so that even in a process of dieting, we can be aware of that and then identify, okay, is this a case that I want to kind of seek help about? So of course, you were sharing that eating disorders, they don't just go away. This is something that we need to, if we're dealing with it, if we're struggling with it, we need to get help. Now, of course, Muslims, we have come a long way in our discussions of mental health. We see now a lot of discussions about depression, about anxiety, but there's very, very low awareness for eating disorders. And you mentioned that the second highest risk of death in terms of mental illness is eating disorders. Any family with young girls, or young boys for that matter, who are growing up, they're dealing with these pressures at school. Anyone who is on social media is dealing with these pressures. So this is something that absolutely affects every single one of us. So any advice on how to normalize these discussions within families and how to make getting help for an eating disorder or speaking with a therapist something more normal? Because that is not normal right now in Muslim families.
Yeah, it's a very good question. When you're talking about like how can we make it more normal to seek help or to take that first step, it starts with us. It starts with modeling. So I work a lot with families, and a lot of times like when I get calls, it's more about like, oh, my son is this or my daughter is this. And I always like to take a step back and check in and be like, well, how do you cope with stress? How do you regulate your emotions? What do you say around food? The messages that we send in the house and the role that parents play sets the tone. This is not to blame mental illness on parents, not at all. In fact, one of the biggest myths for eating disorders, there's a lot of blame around parents or family. And again, mental illnesses and eating disorders are very complex. Perhaps it could be a risk factor, but it's not the only cause. So part of normalizing it is starting with ourselves. And when we start with ourselves and start modeling it, it becomes the culture in the house. So just creating a culture of, emotional safety, just, connecting emotionally with our kids. A lot of times we are so concerned over their grade on their math test or like if they made the basketball team or all these big achievements, but what about how they're feeling and how they're feeling on the inside and they're experiencing and, what they're experiencing and whether they're going through bullying or other experiences. Do you have that emotional attunement? That's the word. Are you attuned to what your child is going through? Because again, eating disorders, it's less so about food and more about control. So when there's a lot of unaddressed maybe challenges that are going on in the home environment for a lot of teens, like the only thing that they can control and they have a sense of control over could be their food intake. That's one way of coping with it. So just being attuned, emotional attunement is really important. Yeah.
And we can also apply that to ourselves, right? Like emotional attunement to our own struggles and approach towards food and dieting.
Yes, absolutely. What is your motivation? What's your intention? So even just reframing our thought can make a big difference.
Yeah.
Because even if you were to quote unquote fail at that exercise, maybe not reach your goal, the underlying emotions of guilt and shame and all of that will not be present, because the way you're approaching it is very different.
Yes, SubhanAllah, and I love the points that you're highlighting, and that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to have this presentation, because for me as a fitness instructor, like, it's part of the aspect of responsibly talking about dieting and fitness by making sure that we're making sure we're not sliding into the realm of disordered eating, and that can happen very quickly. So it's not, so here we're just highlighting that you can absolutely make steps to improve your health, but we have to be very mindful, self-aware, and have that emotional attunement to ourselves and our families to recognize when that can potentially we can be having these dangerous behaviors, these symptoms of concern, and recognize that there are absolutely resources to get help for those. I love what you said about modeling, and just kind of a really practical point that you were bringing up. When we're talking with, our families, so often comments about others' bodies, celebrities' bodies. It's very common that, say you're watching a movie, that, oh, she didn't look too good or whatever, she looked this or that way. And just because they're a celebrity doesn't mean that it's okay to backbite them, but it also means that it's the detrimental effects on our own psychological health when we make those types of comments are absolutely still there. So that aspect of modeling, like, all of us here can make that commitment to not talk about each other's bodies. Any advice in terms of the self-talk that we have when we look in the mirror? I know so many women, I struggled with that as well in my weight loss journey. You look in the mirror and immediately you start zoning in on all the things that you don't like, and you just start having this really negative self-talk. So any advice on kind of just dealing with that?
So when it comes to self-worth, explore your self-worth in other ways. Like, your body is only one aspect of you. And I think this is where we can harness our spirituality and connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that our body is also temporary too. So if our self-worth is only based on our body, on our physical body, at one point that body is going to be buried. At one point that body is not going to last us into the afterlife. Wouldn't you want a criteria for your self-worth that not only benefits you in this life, but also in the hereafter as well? That's a win-win kind of situation, where not only are you basing your worth on something that's beyond your physical health, but you're also basing it on something that will strengthen you spiritually as well.
Somebody who had just shared in the comments as well, that a family member is struggling with an eating disorder. Resources, next steps, so that they can continue getting help that they need.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It takes a lot of courage to put yourself out there and ask, what's the first step for recovery? Never wait until somebody is sick enough. Early intervention is key. Get the conversation going with your family doctor, primary physician. I actually have a guide that I'm going to share with Amina as well, about like certain, sometimes like we may go to that first meeting with the family doctor and not know what to talk about. So getting yourself organized. What are the observations you've witnessed physically, psychologically, the patterns, for how long, so that way you're organized, you're able to, organize your thoughts. So you have like a case for the family doctor to actually take it seriously. Some primary physicians, they may brush it off and say, oh, it's just a phase. She's a teenager or he's a teenager. Do take it seriously. Be your child's best advocate. Not any mental health professional can treat eating disorders. They need special training. Ask them specifically, do you have experience treating eating disorders? And if you can't find anyone locally right now because of the pandemic, a lot are offering virtual care. Keep searching for the right one.
Mention it to your doctor.
Yeah.
So, a lot of the women who I will coach in my fitness boot camp, that they'll come with a long list of concerns, symptoms. This is how I demonstrate emotional eating. This is what I'm struggling with. And then, the way that we need to start getting help isn't being pursued there. So, it's just, I'm dealing with this. I'm struggling with this.
Yeah.
So we need to look for the people who have the expertise, the therapeutic knowledge to actually guide you on that path. So that's a case of mentioning it to your family doctor, asking for if they know any therapists who they could refer you to. If that's not a possibility, as you mentioned, looking at online options as well. So the resources are there, but perhaps it's just the lack of knowledge on what are those resources, inshallah. This is the start of the conversation. Of course, in a brief hour presentation, we're only starting to scratch the surface. So this is that aspect of awareness, recognizing if there's a problem in your family, recognizing those symptoms. The next step is seeking out help. going down that therapeutic journey, inshallah. So, Jazakallah, thank you so much for joining us, Amal. Mahnoor says the session was amazing, mashallah, and bridging that gap between health and psychology. Absolutely agree. So, thank you so much, Amal. May Allah SWT bless you and allow you to continue to be an amazing resource for the Muslim community and bridging that gap. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. If you found it beneficial, let us know in the comments below. What were the key takeaways? Do you want more of these discussions on bridging that psychological aspect with our physical health? Let us know in the comments if you enjoyed and benefited from this discussion, and if you would like to see more of these chats in future. We can't wait to hear your comments, and until our next live session together, stay blessed and stay fit. Salam.